April 16th, 1945. 14:37 hours, Camp 11 Prisoner of War Interrogation Center, outside Wiesbaden, Germany. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered twice before settling into a steady, sulphurous glow that cast long shadows across the concrete floor of the interrogation room. And in that uncertain light sat Oberst Friedrich Steiner, his iron cross still pinned to a tunic that had not been cleaned in 3 weeks, his hands folded on a wooden table scarred with the cigarette burns and the initials of 100 men who had sat in this same chair before him. The room smelled of disinfectant and old sweat and the particular staleness that accumulates in places where men wait to be questioned about battles they have lost. Steiner had been waiting for 6 hours. He had been told nothing. The American guards who brought him here had been polite, almost friendly, which unnerved him more than hostility would have done, because he knew what interrogations were supposed to look like, and this casual indifference suggested something worse than cruelty. It suggested irrelevance. When the door finally opened, it was not an intelligence officer who entered, but a civilian in shirt sleeves, carrying a leather briefcase and a clipboard thick with papers, his tie loosened in the spring heat, his face bearing the unremarkable features of a man who might work in an insurance office or a university administration building. He sat down across from Steiner without introducing himself, opened the briefcase, and removed a single photograph which he placed on the table between them with the careful precision of someone laying down a particularly strong card in a game of poker. The photograph showed a factory floor stretching into an impossibly distant vanishing point. Row after row of aircraft fuselages in various stages of assembly, each one identical to the last, each one representing a level of industrial capacity that Steiner's mind immediately rejected as either a trick of perspective or outright fabrication. "Willow Run," the civilian said, his German serviceable but accented with the flat vowels of the American Midwest. "Bombers, one every 63 minutes. Steiner looked at the photograph for a long moment, then looked up at the American with an expression that mixed contempt with something that might have been pity. Because clearly this man either thought German officers were idiots who could be impressed by obvious propaganda, or was himself a fool who believed his own nation's absurd claims about production rates that violated every principle of manufacturing logistics that Steiner had learned in 2 decades of military service. "That is physically impossible," Steiner said, his voice carrying the patient tone of a professor, correcting a particularly dense student. "A 4-engine heavy bomber requires approximately 150,000 man-hours to construct under optimal conditions. Your photograph shows perhaps 200 aircraft in various stages of completion, even if you operated 3 full shifts with no downtime, which no factory in the world can sustain. The mathematics simply do not work." The American smiled. Not with triumph, but with something stranger, a kind of weary recognition, as if he'd heard this objection before and knew exactly how the conversation would proceed from this point forward. He reached into his briefcase again. What emerged was not another photograph, but a document, typewritten on official letterhead, stamped with seals and signatures and reference numbers that gave it the unmistakable authenticity of genuine military bureaucracy. And as the American slid it across the table, Steiner felt the first cold touch of something that was not quite fear, but was definitely not confidence either. The document was a production manifest from the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run facility for the month of March 1945, and it listed in precise, accountant-dry language the following facts. 432 B-24 Liberator heavy bombers completed and delivered to the United States Army Air Forces, representing an average production rate of 1 aircraft every 51 minutes and 43 seconds for every hour the facility operated, which according to the attached shift schedules was 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, with maintenance downtime accounting for less than 4% of total operational hours. "That is propaganda," Steiner said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty, because the document looked entirely real and the numbers were too specific, too detailed, too boring to be fiction. Propaganda always rounded numbers, always dealt in clean hundreds and thousands, never in the messy specificity of 51 minutes and 43 seconds. The American pulled out another document, then another, then a stack of them, each one from a different source: Ford internal memos, Army Air Force's inspection reports, civilian newspaper articles from Detroit and Los Angeles and Seattle, photographs taken by different people at different times, showing the same impossible reality. And as the pile grew on the table between them, Steiner felt the ground beneath his assumptions beginning to shift in a way that reminded him of the first moment of an artillery barrage, when the world stops being solid and becomes something fluid and unreliable. One of the documents was a diary entry from a German agent who had toured American factories before the war, describing production lines that moved with mechanical precision, workers who changed shifts without stopping the assembly process, a system of interchangeable parts so standardized that components manufactured in Michigan could be shipped to California and installed without modification. "Your agent recommended against war with America," the American said, tapping the diary. "His report went to Berlin in 1938. I don't think anyone read it." Steiner said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like either capitulation or denial, and both were equally unbearable to a man who had spent 30 years believing that German engineering represented the apex of human technical achievement, that precision and quality would always triumph over crude mass production, that one Tiger tank was worth 10 Sherman tanks precisely because it was built by craftsmen who understood their trade rather than by assembly line workers who merely followed instructions. The American seemed to sense this internal struggle and leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had already won the argument and was now simply waiting for his opponent to realize it. Outside the concrete walls of the interrogation room, spring rain had begun to fall, a soft percussion that created the illusion of privacy, even though Steiner knew that at least 3 people were listening to this conversation through whatever recording devices the Americans had hidden in the ceiling or walls. "Let me show you something else," the American said. And this time, what came out of the briefcase was not a document but a small mechanical component, roughly the size of a man's fist, made of stamped steel with a series of precisely machined grooves and bolt holes that Steiner recognized immediately as part of an engine mounting bracket. The American placed it on the table with a metallic clink. "Pick it up. Examine it. Tell me what you see." Steiner hesitated, then lifted the bracket and turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, running his fingers along the edges where the steel had been cut and formed. And what he saw disturbed him more than any photograph or document, because it represented something that violated his understanding of how industrial production worked at scale. The bracket was crude in its simplicity, with none of the elegant complexity that characterized German engineering, but every edge was clean, every hole was perfectly aligned, every surface showed the unmistakable signs of having been produced by machinery that operated with absolute consistency. "It is American," he said finally. "Mass-produced, low quality." "It's from a B-24 that crashed in France last month," the American said. The aircraft had flown 83 combat missions before mechanical failure. That bracket was designed to be replaced after 50 missions. It lasted 66% longer than its engineered lifespan. He paused, letting that information settle. "Now tell me, how many missions did your aircraft average before they were shot down or grounded for repairs?" The answer was somewhere between 12 and 15 missions, depending on the theatre and the year, but Steiner was not about to volunteer that information to an enemy interrogator, no matter how pointless the secrecy had become. The American seemed to read his silence as confirmation. "The bracket you're holding," he continued, "was one of 47,000 identical brackets produced at a single Ford facility in Dearborn, Michigan, during a 16-hour period on February 9th of this year. 47,000 in 16 hours, that's 2,937 brackets per hour, or 49 per minute, or roughly 1 bracket every 1.2 seconds continuously for 16 hours, with a defect rate of less than 0.03%. The mathematics were staggering. Not because Steiner could not follow them, but because he could follow them perfectly, and they led to conclusions that were incompatible with everything he'd been told about American industrial capacity, about the supposed inefficiency of democratic capitalism, about the racial inferiority of a mongrel nation that had no true culture or discipline. He set the bracket down on the table carefully, as if it was something dangerous. "You brought me here to show me factory statistics," he said, and there was genuine confusion in his voice now, because this was not how interrogations were supposed to work. This was not how prisoners of war were supposed to be treated, and the absence of the expected cruelty or manipulation left him without a framework for understanding what was happening. "We brought you here," the American said, "because someone in Washington decided that you and about 300 other German officers need to understand why you lost before you go home and start believing your own propaganda about stab-in-the-back myths and Jewish conspiracies and treacherous politicians." He pulled out another document, this one showing a map of the United States with red dots marking factory locations, hundreds of them, thousands of them, concentrated around the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley, but spreading out across the entire continent like a rash of industrial capacity. This is education, Oberst Steiner, not interrogation. Education. The distinction felt meaningless to Steiner because the effect was the same, a systematic dismantling of assumptions, a forced confrontation with data that could not be ignored or dismissed. And he found himself thinking of Hauptmann Werner Vogel, who had sat across from him at a cafe in Munich in the summer of 1942 and argued over expensive wine that neither of them could really afford. That Germany was going to lose the war because the Americans would simply bury the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of production that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Steiner had thought Vogel was being defeatist, possibly even treasonous, and had reported the conversation to his commanding officer, who had done nothing about it because by 1942 everyone was having those conversations in private, even if they still professed confidence in public. Vogel had been killed in Russia 6 months later, and Steiner had never apologized for the report. And now, sitting in this concrete room with an American civilian who spoke patient German and showed him photographs of impossible factories, he wondered if Vogel had known something that the rest of them had been too proud or too stupid or too indoctrinated to see. How many factories? Steiner asked. Because he needed to know the scale, needed to understand the dimensions of the thing that had destroyed his country. The American consulted his clipboard. Producing aircraft approximately 18,000 facilities of various sizes, producing all war materiel approximately 300,000. If you include subcontractors and component suppliers, 300,000, the number was obscene. Germany had perhaps 5,000 factories that could be classified as genuinely industrial, and most of those had been built in the frantic rearmament years after 1935, and even at peak production they had struggled to supply a military machine that was constantly hungry for more tanks, more aircraft, more ammunition, more everything. The American was watching him with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been something colder. The look of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis to a patient who still believed themselves healthy. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less conversational and more pedagogical, as if he were shifting from casual demonstration into formal lecture mode. "Let me tell you about a place called Gary, Indiana," he said, pulling out yet another photograph, this one showing blast furnaces that rose like industrial cathedrals against a smoke-darkened sky. Structures so massive that the human figures visible at their base looked like insects crawling on the legs of giants. The United States Steel Corporation operates a facility there that covers approximately 1,500 acres of land along the southern shore of Lake Michigan, and that single facility produces more steel in 1 month than the entire Ruhr Valley produced in the best quarter of 1943. "That is impossible," Steiner said reflexively. But the word had lost its power through repetition, had become a kind of verbal tick that he could not seem to stop, even though he knew how pointless it was to keep denying facts that kept arriving in document after document, photograph after photograph. each one corroborated by sources that had no reason to coordinate their lies and every reason to report accurately because they were writing for internal consumption, for accountants and managers and military planners who needed real numbers, not propaganda fantasies. The American ignored the protest and continued as if Steiner had not spoken at all. Gary works 24 hours a day, 3 full shifts with staggered breaks so that the furnaces never cool. The ore arrives by rail and by ship from mines in Minnesota. The limestone comes from quarries in Michigan. The coal comes from Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And the entire system operates with the kind of logistical precision that your general staff used to pride itself on achieving in military operations. He paused to let that comparison sink in. The implicit suggestion that American industry routinely accomplished what German military efficiency could only achieve at its absolute peak. In 1944, Gary produced 11.3 million tons of finished steel. That's 31,000 tons per day, every day, for 365 days. No holidays, no downtime for ideological celebrations, just continuous production. Steiner did the mathematics in his head and arrived at numbers that made him feel physically ill because they represented a level of industrial might that could not be defeated by tactics or courage or even technological superiority. They represented the kind of overwhelming material advantage that rendered all other factors essentially irrelevant in the long term. 11 million tons of steel translated into tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of trucks, millions of rifles, billions of rounds of ammunition, and that was just one facility in one city in one region of a country that had dozens of similar industrial complexes spread across a landmass that German bombers could not reach, and German submarines could not effectively blockade. "You're telling me this to break my spirit," he said quietly. And it was not quite an accusation because he was genuinely uncertain about the Americans' motives, about whether this education was meant to be cruel or compassionate or simply pragmatic. "I'm telling you this," the American said, "because the alternative is that you go home and spend the next 30 years believing that Germany lost because of bad luck or poor leadership or betrayal. And then, in 1975, some politician with a nice uniform and a persuasive voice tells you that Germany just needs to try again, just needs to be more ruthless this time, just needs to believe harder, and you nod along because you never understood what actually happened." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and for the first time his expression showed something other than professional detachment. It showed anger, or perhaps exhaustion. The weariness of someone who had seen too many wars and understood that most of them started because the losers of the previous war had learned the wrong lessons. "This is not about breaking your spirit, Oberst. This is about making sure you understand that what happened was inevitable, that it was baked into the numbers from the moment your government decided to fight a country with 10 times your industrial capacity and 20 times your access to raw materials." The rain outside had intensified into a proper storm, and somewhere in the building a door slammed with a sound like a gunshot, and Steiner flinched before he could stop himself because his nerves were not what they had been before the war. Before the years of constant bombardment and retreat and the growing certainty that every order from Berlin was based on fantasies about wonder weapons and secret treaties and miraculous reversals that would never materialize. He thought about asking for water or a cigarette, but decided against it because accepting American hospitality felt like accepting American premises. And he was not quite ready for that. Even though he could feel his resistance crumbling under the weight of all these documents and photographs and statistics that kept arriving like waves against a seawall that had been built to withstand storms, but not tsunamis. The American must have sensed his state of mind because he shifted tactics slightly, pulling out a leather-bound notebook that had clearly seen heavy use, its cover scuffed and its pages dog-eared. "This belonged to Oberst Heinrich Müller, one of your colleagues from the 7th Army," he said, opening it to a page marked with a strip of paper. "He was captured near the Rhine 3 weeks ago, and he spent his first 2 days in custody writing down everything he could remember about his experiences on the Western Front." He turned the notebook around so Steiner could read it, and the handwriting was cramped and hurried but perfectly legible. the script of an educated man trying to record observations before memory faded them. Read the section I've marked. Steiner read, "We fired on the American column for approximately 40 minutes with everything we had. Machine guns and mortars and the last of our anti-tank rounds, and we destroyed perhaps 20 vehicles and killed God knows how many men. And we thought we had won a victory until the smoke cleared and we saw that the column stretched back for kilometres. Hundreds of trucks and half-tracks and tanks. And they simply drove around the wreckage and kept coming. And I realised then that we were not fighting an army, but a machine. A system that could absorb losses that would have crippled us and just continue functioning as if nothing had happened." The entry continued for another paragraph describing how Muller's unit had retreated in good order, how they had prepared defensive positions in the next town, how the Americans had arrived 6 hours later and subjected them to an artillery barrage that lasted 90 minutes and expended more shells than Muller had seen fired in total during the entire previous month of operations. "Muller is not a stupid man," the American said, taking the notebook back. He graduated from the War Academy in 1936, served in Poland and France with distinction, received commendations for tactical innovation, and by all accounts was exactly the kind of officer that your system was designed to produce: intelligent, adaptable, capable of independent decision-making within the framework of mission-type orders. The American closed the notebook and set it aside. And yet he spent 2 weeks fighting a retreating action against an enemy that kept replacing its losses faster than he could inflict them, and the experience broke something in his understanding of how wars work. He kept saying the same thing over and over during his first interrogation. They don't care about casualties. They have too many of everything. Steiner wanted to object that caring about casualties was what separated civilized armies from barbarian hordes, but the objection died in his throat because he remembered too many conversations with other officers who had returned from the Eastern Front or North Africa or Italy talking about American artillery barrages that went on for hours, about air raids that came in waves of dozens or hundreds of aircraft, about supply columns that stretched to the horizon and kept coming no matter how many you destroyed. And all of them had used variations of the same phrase that Muller had used: too many of everything. It was not that American soldiers were better trained or more motivated or more tactically sophisticated than German soldiers. It was that they arrived with so much material support that they could afford to make mistakes, could afford to trade lives and equipment for time and territory in a way that no German commander could ever contemplate, because every Tiger tank that broke down was irreplaceable. Every experienced pilot who died was a loss that could not be made good. Every ton of ammunition expended had to be carefully rationed because the next shipment might not arrive for weeks. "Let me show you the mathematics of this," the American said, and now his voice took on the quality of a professor moving into the technical section of a lecture, the part where abstract concepts became concrete numbers and the full scale of the thing being described finally revealed itself. In 1944, the United States produced 40,000 tanks. Not tank chassis, not tank hulls, not tanks in various stages of assembly, but complete, fully functional, combat-ready tanks that were shipped to Europe or the Pacific and put into service. 40,000. That's 109 tanks per day, every single day, for 365 days. Germany produced approximately 19,000 tanks in the same period, and that was your best year. The peak of your production, achieved by stripping resources from every other sector of the economy and running factories 24 hours a day with slave labour and foreign workers and anyone else you could conscript into the industrial machine. The disparity was crushing, more than 2-to-1 in America's favour, and that was before you factored in the Soviet Union's production, which added another 29,000 tanks to the Allied total, or Britain's contribution of another 5,000. Numbers that meant the Axis powers were facing an enemy that could field 4 or 5 or 6 tanks for every one they could produce. And no amount of technical superiority could overcome that kind of numerical disadvantage in the long run. Steiner had seen the reports about German tank aces who destroyed 50 or 60 or 70 Allied tanks in their careers, and those numbers had seemed impressive until you realised that for every German ace there were 20 American tank crews who were merely adequate but who kept coming back with new tanks every time the old ones were destroyed. Grinding down the German advantage through simple attrition, 40,000 tanks required approximately 200 million man-hours of direct labour to produce. The American continued, his voice maintaining that same relentless pedagogical rhythm that made every statement sound like an established fact rather than a debatable claim. That number does not include the labour required to mine the ore, smelt the steel, manufacture the components, transport the materials, or any of the thousands of other steps in the supply chain. It represents only the final assembly labour, the hours spent actually putting the tanks together in facilities like Chrysler's tank arsenal in Detroit, which by itself produced 25,000 M4 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1945, or Ford's River Rouge complex, or General Motors facilities in Indiana and Ohio. He pulled out another photograph showing an assembly line where Sherman tanks moved along rails like products in a canning factory, each one at a slightly different stage of completion, workers swarming over them with pneumatic tools and welding torches, the whole scene lit by arc lights that turned the factory floor into something that looked like a vision of an industrial hell or heaven, depending on your perspective. The Chrysler Arsenal covered 1,700,000 square feet under a single roof, the American said, pointing to details in the photograph. It employed 40,000 workers operating in 3 shifts. It received raw materials by rail at one end of the building and delivered finished tanks at the other end approximately 48 hours later. The entire process was choreographed like a ballet, every worker knowing exactly what task to perform and in what sequence, every tool and component positioned exactly where it needed to be. No wasted motion, no wasted time, no wasted material. It was the mathematics of elimination, the systematic removal of every inefficiency until what remained was pure productive capacity operating at maximum theoretical output. Steiner found himself staring at the photograph with a kind of horrified fascination, because it represented everything that German engineering philosophy had explicitly rejected: standardization over customization, quantity over quality, simplicity over sophistication. And yet it had worked. It had produced an army that conquered Europe in reverse, that pushed the Wehrmacht back kilometre by kilometre until there was nothing left but rubble and surrender. The Sherman was an inferior tank, he said, because he needed to assert something, needed to maintain some fragment of the worldview that had sustained him through 6 years of war. Our Panthers and Tigers were superior in every measurable way: armour, firepower, mechanical reliability. The Sherman had a 75% crew survival rate when hit. The American replied without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for exactly this objection. Your Panthers and Tigers had approximately a 40% survival rate. The Sherman could be repaired in the field with standard tools and replacement parts that were interchangeable across the entire production run. Your tanks required specialized tools and hand-fitted components that often had to be manufactured individually. The Sherman ran on gasoline that was available everywhere. Your tanks ran on gasoline that had to be synthesized from coal because you had no oil fields and your supply lines from Romania kept getting bombed. He paused, then delivered what was clearly meant to be the killing blow to Steiner's argument, and we built 40,000 of them. You built 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. Even if we accept your premise that each German tank was worth 3 Allied tanks in combat effectiveness, which I don't, you still lose the mathematics. The numbers hung in the air between them like a mathematical proof that admitted no counter-argument, no appeal to courage or skill or tactical genius, just the cold arithmetic of industrial capacity multiplied by time and ruthlessly applied to the problem of destroying an enemy army through sheer material superiority. And Steiner felt something inside him crack open like an egg, some shell of certainty that had protected him from understanding the full magnitude of what his nation had attempted, and why it had been doomed from the beginning. He thought about all the young men he'd sent into battle with promises that German quality would triumph over Allied quantity. All the speeches he'd given about fighting spirit and technological edge and the superiority of the defensive position. And he wondered how many of them had died still believing those lies, or had died having already figured out the truth but fought anyway because there was nothing else to do. The American seemed to sense that he'd reached some critical threshold in Steiner's comprehension, because he stood up and walked to the small window that looked out onto the muddy yard where prisoners took their daily exercise. His hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded Steiner of 100 staff briefings, where some colonel or general had stood exactly like this while delivering bad news about retreats or encirclements or divisions that had ceased to exist. "Let me tell you about the day that Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle visited the Willow Run plant," the American said, speaking to the window rather than to Steiner. This was in late 1942 after he came back from the Tokyo raid. Ford brought him through as a publicity gesture, and they took him down the assembly line from the raw aluminum ingots at the beginning to the finished bombers at the end, and at one point they showed him the section where they were installing engines, and he asked how many spare engines they kept in inventory in case one of the production line motors failed during testing. The American turned back to face Steiner, and his expression was strange, almost embarrassed, as if he were about to reveal something that he himself found difficult to believe. The plant manager told him they didn't keep spare engines. Doolittle thought he had misunderstood, so he asked again. More clearly this time, "What do you do if an engine fails during testing?" And the manager said, "We install a new engine from the production line and keep moving." Doolittle said, "But doesn't that disrupt your production schedule?" And the manager said, "We're producing engines faster than we can install them. So taking one off the line creates no delay whatsoever. We have so many engines that storage is actually a bigger problem than scarcity." Steiner closed his eyes for a moment, letting the implications of that story wash over him, trying to imagine a world where military equipment was so abundant that supply logistics became a problem of excess rather than shortage, where factory managers worried about having too many engines rather than too few, where the entire concept of rationing and prioritization that had dominated every German military decision for the past 4 years simply did not apply. He thought about the last Tiger tank his unit had received, in February of 1945, which had arrived without its radio because there were no radios available, and they had cannibalized a radio from a destroyed Panzer IV and spent 3 days trying to make it work with the Tiger's electrical system. And eventually they had just sent the Tiger into battle without radio communication, because even a partially functional Tiger was better than no Tiger at all. And now this American was telling him about factories that produce so many engines that they could throw them away without disrupting production schedules. In 1,944 inches, the American continued, returning to his chair and pulling out what appeared to be a financial ledger, thick with columns of numbers and notations. The United States spent approximately $93 billion on war production. That represents approximately 40% of the total gross national product, which means that for every dollar spent on war materiel, there was still another $1.50 being spent on civilian consumption, on maintaining an economy that continued to function, continued to feed its people, continued to produce automobiles and refrigerators and washing machines, even while simultaneously producing the largest military arsenal in human history. He ran his finger down a column of figures. Germany spent approximately 70% of its gross national product on war production in 1944, and your economy was approximately 1/4 the size of ours to begin with, which means you were spending nearly everything you had and still being outproduced by a factor of 4 or 5 to 1 by an enemy that was operating at less than half of its theoretical maximum capacity. The numbers were obscene in their implications because they meant that America had defeated Germany while essentially fighting with one hand tied behind its back, that the massive armies and endless supply columns and overwhelming air superiority had all been achieved without even fully mobilizing the industrial potential of the country, that there was a vast reserve of productive capacity that had never been tapped because it simply was not necessary. Steiner tried to imagine what would have happened if America had gone to 70% war production, had truly mobilized the way Germany had mobilized, and the mental image that resulted was so overwhelming that his mind shied away from it, like a horse refusing a jump. "We built 88,000 landing craft," the American said, and now he was no longer reading from documents but simply reciting from memory, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a man recounting a liturgy or a multiplication table. "We built 300,000 aircraft of all types. We produced 434 million tons of steel. We manufactured 47 million tons of ammunition. We laid 600,000 miles of communications wire. We produced 64,000 naval vessels from aircraft carriers to patrol boats. We manufactured 2 million trucks and 5 million rifles and 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition." He paused, letting each number land like a physical blow. "We fed not only our own army and civilian population, but also most of the British army and a significant portion of the Soviet army through Lend-Lease shipments that included 467,000 vehicles, 15,000 aircraft, and 360,000 tons of explosives along with food and fuel and medicine and every other commodity necessary for waging modern war." The avalanche of statistics was deliberately overwhelming, designed to crush any remaining illusions about the balance of power or the possibility of German victory. And it was working because Steiner could feel his carefully constructed understanding of the war collapsing under the weight of numbers that were simply too large to be ignored or dismissed or explained away as propaganda. The American leaned back in his chair again, watching Steiner with the patience of a man who had delivered this same lecture dozens or hundreds of times before, and knew exactly what stages of denial and acceptance each prisoner would pass through before arriving at the inevitable conclusion. "In September of 1944 inches, he said, his voice dropping slightly as if he were sharing something confidential. "Your General Staff conducted an analysis of American logistics in France based on intelligence gathered from captured documents and aerial reconnaissance. The report concluded that the American supply system was operating at approximately 65% efficiency due to the destruction of French rail infrastructure and the limited capacity of the port facilities that had been captured. 65% efficiency. Your analysts wrote that figure down as if it represented significant Allied weakness, as if the fact that American logistics were not operating at peak capacity meant that Germany still had a chance to achieve strategic objectives in the West." He pulled out a photostat copy of what appeared to be a German military document, its Gothic script and official seals marking it as genuine staff work rather than propaganda. What your analysts failed to understand, or perhaps could not bring themselves to acknowledge, was that American logistics operating at 65% efficiency were still delivering more supplies to the front than the Wehrmacht's logistics had ever achieved at 100% efficiency during the entire war. The Allied forces in France were receiving 30,000 tons of supplies per day through partially destroyed ports and improvised supply lines, while your armies in the same theatre were receiving approximately 4,000 tons per day through intact rail networks and dedicated supply infrastructure that had been built over decades. He set the document down with deliberate care. The report actually recommended that German forces concentrate their remaining offensive capability on disrupting Allied supply lines, as if further reducing Allied logistics from 65% to 50% efficiency would somehow change the fundamental mathematics of the situation. Steiner remembered reading that report, or one very much like it, during a staff meeting in October where they had discussed options for autumn operations, and he remembered feeling a flicker of hope that the American supply situation might actually be vulnerable. That if they could just disrupt those supply lines effectively, then perhaps the Allied advance would stall and winter would arrive and there would be time to regroup and reorganize and possibly even negotiate some kind of settlement that did not involve complete destruction. The hope had been absurd. He could see that now, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were facing, but at the time it had seemed like rational military analysis rather than desperate fantasy. One of your captured officers, I won't tell you his name, was taken to see the supply depots at Cherbourg after the port was fully operational, but the American said, and something in his tone suggested that this was the story he had been building toward all along, the anecdote that would complete Steiner's education in the most visceral way possible. The American commander who gave him the tour was trying to be gracious, trying to show that the Americans were not barbarians despite what German propaganda had claimed, and he took this officer through the warehouses where supplies were being sorted and distributed, and at one point they came to a depot that was about the size of a city block, completely filled with artillery shells stacked on pallets from floor to ceiling. The American commander explained that this represented approximately 3 days' worth of ammunition for the artillery units in that sector, and the German officer, who had spent the previous 2 years watching his own units ration ammunition until they were down to 5 or 10 shells per gun per day, simply could not process what he was seeing. The American paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a note of something that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. The German officer asked how long it had taken to accumulate that stockpile, and the American commander said it was not a stockpile, it was normal operational inventory, that shipments of that size arrived every 2 days and were consumed every 3 days, and there was never any concern about running short because the supply chain just kept delivering more shells from factories in Pennsylvania and Ohio that produced ammunition 24 hours a day without interruption. The German officer asked to sit down. The American commander thought he might be ill. In his post-capture interview, the German officer said that the moment he truly understood that Germany had lost the war was not when he was captured or when he saw American tanks rolling through his position, but when he stood in that warehouse and tried to calculate how many train cars would be required to deliver that quantity of ammunition every 2 days, and realized that the Americans were operating a logistics system that moved more material in a week than the entire German rail network could move in a month. Steiner could picture the scene perfectly because he had lived through enough supply crises to understand exactly what that German officer had felt the visceral shock of seeing abundance where you expected scarcity. The cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile reality with your assumptions about how the world worked. The sudden understanding that you'd been fighting a war you could never win because the material foundations of victory simply did not exist. He wondered if the officer in question had been anyone he knew, if it might have been Vogel or Müller, or any of the dozens of other competent professionals who had served with him and died still believing that German tactical superiority would somehow overcome Allied industrial might. The Americans threw away more material than we ever had, Steiner said quietly. And it was not quite a question, but it was not quite a statement either. Just a verbal acknowledgement of a truth that he had been resisting for the past 2 hours but could no longer deny. The waste in your system, the inefficiency, the damaged goods and the excess inventory, and the supplies that never reached the front because they were lost or stolen or simply abandoned, that waste exceeded our entire productive capacity. Yes, the American said simply, and there was no triumph in his voice, just a flat confirmation of fact. In the winter of 1944, American forces in Belgium abandoned approximately 15,000 tons of supplies during the initial German offensive because they had to retreat faster than they could load their trucks. And within 2 weeks, those supplies had been completely replaced, and the forces had resumed their advance as if nothing had happened. Your forces, by contrast, had committed your last operational reserves to that offensive, had stripped the Eastern Front of mobile divisions and accumulated ammunition stockpiles for months, and when the attack failed you had nothing left, no reserves to commit, no ammunition to sustain another effort, no fuel to maneuver what remained of your armoured units. The American opened his briefcase one final time and removed a small object wrapped in brown paper, which he unwrapped carefully to reveal a glass Coca-Cola bottle, empty and slightly dusty, the distinctive curved shape unmarred by any damage. This was found in the wreckage of a German staff car near Bastogne. One of your officers had picked it up from an abandoned American position and kept it, and when he was captured the bottle was in his personal effects along with his maps and his sidearm and his identification papers. Steiner looked at the bottle and felt something very close to despair, because he understood immediately what it represented, not just American abundance, but American normalcy. The fact that the United States military transported soft drinks to the front lines, that individual soldiers expected access to consumer goods even in combat zones, that the logistics system, which was simultaneously delivering tanks and ammunition and fuel, also made room for carbonated beverages, because maintaining morale through small luxuries was considered more important than the marginal inefficiency of hauling non-essential cargo. "We found American cigarettes and chocolate and canned peaches," Steiner said, his voice hollow. "We thought it meant they were soft, that they needed these comforts because they lacked fighting spirit. We did not understand that it meant they had so much productive capacity that they could afford to waste it on luxuries while still overwhelming us with essential supplies." The Coca-Cola Company operated 64 bottling plants in combat zones during the war, the American said, setting the bottle on the table between them, where it caught the light from the overhead bulb and glowed amber like some kind of industrial relic or religious icon. They produced 10 billion bottles of Coca-Cola between 1941 and 1945 for military consumption. 10 billion. That number represents more individual units of production than the total number of artillery shells fired by the German army on all fronts during the entire war. It was not a strategic priority. It was not essential to victory. It was simply something the American industrial system could do in the margins, in the leftover capacity that remained after building ships and planes and tanks and everything else required for waging modern war on a global scale. The absurdity of the comparison, shells versus soft drinks, should have been laughable, but instead it was crushing because it illustrated with perfect clarity the gulf between German capacity and American capacity, between an economy stretched to its absolute breaking point and an economy operating with such surplus that it could afford to devote resources to morale-boosting luxuries that had no military value whatsoever. Steiner thought about the last Christmas of the war, December 1944, when his unit had received no special rations and no mail and no acknowledgement of the holiday, except for a brief message from division headquarters, reminding them that Germanic warrior spirit required no material comfort to sustain it. And now he learned that American soldiers in the same theatre had received turkey dinners and Coca-Cola, and packages from home delivered through a logistics system that never stopped functioning, no matter how many times German forces tried to disrupt it. This was not a war, Steiner said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Defeated in a way that went deeper than military defeat, defeated in understanding rather than merely in fact. This was an industrial execution. You did not outfight us, you simply buried us under a mountain of production that we had no possible way to match or counter, or even meaningfully resist once your industrial machine achieved full operational capacity. Every battle we won, every tactical success, every defensive position held, none of it mattered because you could absorb those losses and replace them and come back stronger while every loss we suffered was permanent and irreplaceable. The American nodded slowly, and for the first time since entering the room he looked genuinely sad rather than merely professional. That is exactly the lesson we need you to understand, Oberst Steiner, because the alternative is that in 20 or 30 years someone convinces Germans that they lost because of betrayal or weakness or insufficient will, and then we have to do this all over again. And next time the weapons will be atomic bombs and the casualties will be measured in millions of civilians rather than millions of soldiers. He began gathering up the documents and photographs, sliding them back into his briefcase with the careful organization of someone who had delivered this briefing many times and would deliver it many more. You were not defeated by cowardice or by Jewish conspiracies or by politicians stabbing the military in the back. You were defeated by mathematics, by the simple arithmetic of industrial capacity multiplied by time and applied without mercy or hesitation to the problem of destroying your capacity to wage war. Steiner sat in silence for a long moment after the American finished speaking, his eyes fixed on the Coca-Cola bottle that still sat on the table between them, and he thought about all the things he had believed and all the ways those beliefs had been systematically proven wrong over the course of this strange interrogation that was not an interrogation, but an education. And he wondered what he was supposed to do with this knowledge now that he possessed it. Outside the window the rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the muddy yard where other German officers walked in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. And he knew that most of them were probably having the same conversation that he had just had. The same confrontation with numbers and facts, and the overwhelming reality of American industrial might that could not be denied or explained away, or incorporated into any mythology of heroic defeat. What happens now? He asked finally, because he needed to know what came after education, what purpose this knowledge was meant to serve beyond simply crushing whatever remained of his professional pride and military identity. The American closed his briefcase and stood up, straightening his tie and buttoning his jacket in preparation for departure. Now you go home eventually, after the occupation is established and Germany is rebuilt and we're satisfied that you understand what happened and why. You go home and you tell the truth, or you stay silent. But either way, you do not participate in building new myths about how Germany was betrayed, or how the war could have been won if only this or that factor had been different. You live with the knowledge that you fought for a regime that started a war it had no capacity to win against enemies whose industrial might exceeded yours by a factor that made victory impossible from the beginning. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle. It was not tactics or strategy or fighting spirit that determined the outcome. Obersteiner. It was the industrial inevitability of mathematics applied to war, and no amount of courage or skill or tactical brilliance could overcome the simple fact that your enemy could build 40,000 tanks while you built 19,000, could produce 300,000 aircraft while you produced 30,000, could absorb casualties and losses and setbacks that would have destroyed your military capacity 10 times over, and still keep coming because the factories never stopped, the supply lines never broke, and the productive capacity never faltered. The door opened and the American left, his footsteps echoing down the concrete corridor until they faded into silence. And Steiner sat alone in the interrogation room with the Coca-Cola bottle on the table and the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, still casting its sulphurous glow across the scarred wooden surface. He picked up the bottle and held it up to the light, seeing his reflection distorted in the curved glass. And he thought about the factory somewhere in America that had produced this bottle, one of 10 billion identical bottles, each one a tiny monument to industrial capacity so vast that it could afford to waste resources on luxuries while simultaneously building the military machine that had crushed the Wehrmacht and conquered Europe and ended the Third Reich not through superior tactics, but through the simple, overwhelming, inexorable mathematics of production. The bottle was cool and smooth in his hands, heavier than he'd expected, and when he set it back down on the table it made a small hollow sound that seemed to echo in the empty room like the closing of a book or the final note of a symphony or the last word of a story that had been told and could not be untold, no matter how much anyone might wish it otherwise.